will be page 17, example 3. Simplify the square root as much as possible. And we're given the square root of 128. So again, there's 3 different ways to do this. You could use prime factorization. You could list all the factors of 128 out and see which is the biggest factor that's a perfect square. Or you could use a perfect square list. I'm going to use a perfect square list for this example. So I'm going to first look, is 128 a perfect square? So I go down this list of numbers. 128 is not in the list, so it's not a perfect square. So which 2 perfect squares is it between? When I look at the list, it's between 121 and 144, so I'm going to put a little marker over here. So I need to go through and see which of these numbers, 121, 100, 81, 64, 49, 36, and so on, which is the biggest one that you could divide into 128. I'll show the work for a couple of them down here. What you're basically doing is taking that 128 and dividing by each of them. I'm going to start with the biggest, 121. When I divide this, I do not get a whole number. 121 is not a factor of 128, so that one does not work. So then I'm going to check 100. Again, if you divide 128 divided by 100, it is not going to be a whole number when you do this division, so it does not go into 128. We're on to 81. 128 divided by 81. Again, when you do this division, 128 divided by 81, it is not a whole number, so 81 is not a factor of 128. We're on to 64. So do 128 divided by 64. When you do this division, you get 2. You get 2. So we know that 64 is a factor of 128. So we're going to simply rewrite the square root of 128 as the square root of 64 times 2. 64 times 2 is 128. So I just rewrote 128 as 64 times 2. Now I'm going to separate this into 2 square roots. I'm going to rewrite this as square root of 64 times the square root of 2. Now we know that 64, the square root of 64 is 8, because 8 times 8 is 64. So I'm going to evaluate the square root. The square root of 64 is 8. And then the square root of 2, 2 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to just leave this as the square root of 2. So my answer, when simplifying the square root of 128, is 8 times the square root of 2.